there's an enormous amount of moralising going on. And I think a lot of that's been encouraged by the fact that when the riots took off, everybody thought it was the end of the world, it was Armageddon. And it looked as though there was no way of controlling these unstoppable people who were doing these outrageous things. And because people had been so frightened by the whole experience, they really then lusted for blood, because you don't like anybody frightening you. So the lust for blood, especially amongst MPs and Conservative MPs in particular, that sense of outrage that anybody should do this to their so-called civilized society was quite intense. My attitude is that this was a government-sponsored riot. It was a riot based to a large extent on the fact that many, many people who led this riot came from what's called the underclass. That means they came from a section of the community who rely on social security, rely on social housing. And over the years that it's taken to develop this new class of people, no class of people has ever existed like this before. If you look at all the historians, you look in the magazines, they talk about riots in the 1950s or riots in the Victoria's time, and nothing's different. This is absolute cobblers. This is government-sponsored riots, because virtually, as I said, virtually all or a large part of people who play that leadership are people living on social security. They're living on state-sponsored poverty. So therefore, poverty has been nationalised by the state. They keep these people poor, they keep these people supplied, and then, lo and behold, when they say to them, you can go away and have your social security, but you don't have to do anything for it, then you get a real groundswell of alienation, government-sponsored alienation. That's totally different from what happened in 1958 with the riots that happened at Notting Hill, the race riots, or happened in the 1880s and the 1890s in London, or even what happened in the Brixton riots. All of those were stops on the road towards this ultimate riot, which I think is because this ultimate riot is the riot of the dispossessed. They've been kept in social security for so long that it's destroyed their ability to become part of society. So my attitude towards this, by all means, Mr. Conservative MP or Mr. Labour MP or Mr. Liberal MP, talk about how outrageous it is, but then look at how much government policy has created this terrible situation. The government itself is broken. Talk about broken Britain. We've got a broken government. We've got a government that produces poverty and extends the life of poverty. And we've got politicians wanting to go around and blame anybody other than themselves. Until people realise that it's the government that is the greatest sponsor of crime and disorder in this country. They are the biggest gang. They are the biggest load of hoodlums, because by their policies and by the way that they've used the taxpayers' money, they have created this situation. So they have to bear the responsibility. Well, rather than moralise about it and telling them off, let's get them to admit that they've screwed up on this one. Not just them, the last government, the government before, the government before. And let's start the process of rebuilding how we deal with poverty. They've got to get away from this idea of blaming the poor, because that does create the idea of them and us. None of these kids were born with a brick in their hand. It's our problem. These kids who are living this kind of social security life are state-sponsored children. They're our children. They're public children, and we have a responsibility for them. So I think the first thing is we've got to start making those kind of changes where we start looking at these people as the result of our criminal neglect, our stupid interest in so-called helping people, but really just giving them handouts. I think also we've got to understand how poverty is enshrined in the very marketplace that we live in, that we are living in a world where poverty is everywhere. There's poverty industries, there's enormous charities, who don't necessarily have a vested interest in getting people out of poverty. They have a vested interest in supplying the poor with relief. So there's a lot of crap talked about getting people out of poverty, and it doesn't happen. Until we actually start investing in dismantling poverty, that means knowing all the causes, finding out, until we do a really good diagnosis, so then we can issue a good prognosis. Until we can start spending our money not on maintaining people in poverty, but on getting them out, then we're on a loser.